So we are going to jump into a new section now, and this is on exposure. So we're going to get the whole exposure thing. We've hopefully gotten the equipment thing behind us. We've got that fairly well figured out. For exposure, there's a lot of different things involved. Let's start with the metering system in the camera. Most cameras are going to have 2, 3, maybe 4 metering systems on how it reads light. And the symbols that they use are slightly different, but we have, in general, multi-segment, which reads wide area, center weighted, more towards the middle, and spot, very much the middle. So the traditional system is the center weighted metering system. And what this is it's looking at the middle 60% of the frame, and it's heavily weighted to what's going on right in the middle of the frame. And this is the system that we had on cameras for many, many years. Photographers wanted something more precise, and so we got spot meters. And the landscape photographers like spot meters because what they could do is they could read the light value in the sky and in the rock and in the trees, and then they could start figuring out, well, this is where we should have our shutter speed because it's a nice balance between the brightest spot and the darkest spot. And there is a whole technique to using a multi-spot meter, checking out what's my highlights, what's my shadows. And this is something that Ansel Adams was all over in his zone system, and he needed to know the brightness of different areas, and he wanted to hold areas to certain levels of brightness. And it's gotten a lot easier in the days of digital because now we can shoot pictures, we can see them out in the field, and we have a better analysis of what we're getting in the field. In the days of film, it was a little bit more of educated guesswork. And now I'm a big fan of the multi-segment metering system. And what this is a way of breaking up the scene into many different boxes, and it compares and contrasts the darkest areas with the lightest areas and gives you a nice balance between all of those. And in general, I have found that the multi-segment system, which goes by different names, Nikon calls it matrix metering, and Canon calls it evaluative metering, does a very good job in most situations. It's not so important these days because we now have the ability to look at the histogram. And the histogram is an analytical way for us to look at an image and judge whether it is too bright or too dark. The back of your screens are kind of close to accurate, but they're not exactly accurate. Chances are in the back of your camera you have an info button or a display button. If you press that button, you'll get a histogram. All cameras have it that have been made in the last 6 years. If you can't figure out how to do it, you need to learn how to work your camera better. You need to get out your instruction manual and find out how to turn this on because it is really, really valuable. So the histogram, it's a graph of the tonal distribution. We're seeing where the bright areas are and where the dark areas are. The vertical part of the graph is describing the number of pixels, and as we go from left to right, we're going from the darkest regions to the midtones up into the highlights. Now, the particular histogram that you see on screen here, this one is kind of interesting because there is no pixels that are perfectly black and there are none that are perfectly white. And the advantage to that is that I can take that into a post-processing program and I can make this a little bit darker or I can make it a little bit brighter. When you photograph something that is pure white, there is nothing else that can be. It is blown out. If something is pure black, it's dark, there's no information, and it's going to be impossible to do anything with that. So you have to be very careful about overexposing and underexposing. And you should be able to look at a photograph and judge what type of histogram is appropriate for it. So I have a little quiz for you at home. I have 3 photographs on screen, and I have 3 histograms. Can you tell which histogram goes with which photo? If we were to take one of these images, a raw image, and we were to take it into Photoshop or Lightroom or any other program you might be using, and we were to adjust the contrast levels, because you can adjust the contrast levels later on, and try to reduce the contrast, we get the image on the right, which in my opinion looks terrible. I don't know what it looks like on your screen, but it looks horrible here, because I've taken a high contrast image and I've tried to reduce the contrast later on. And it just does not work out. I'm trying to lighten up the shadows, but they just do not look natural at all. Let's look at 2 more high contrast photos. We're photographing land. We have some bright light in them as well. You can see the histogram. It really spreads across the entire range. Pixels on the far left, pixels on the far right of that histogram are either dark or very bright. So let's take this image at Second Beach. That's our raw image. Let's take it into Photoshop and try to compress things to try to, pull up information in the shadows. And I don't know what your screen looks like, but the image on the left does not look good on my screen. Looks like we've lost all the shadows. They've tried to be lightened up, but they just don't look normal at all. And what I'm trying to tell you here is that you can't take a high contrast scene and reduce the contrast later. It just doesn't work out in virtually every situation. Now, let's look at the other end of the spectrum. Let's look at low dynamic range photos. And so these are all images that have a low dynamic range. The range from the brightest brights to the darkest darks is not that big a difference. Now, because there's a delay, I'm not going to really ask you, but what do these images have in common? Take a look at them. What's a common thread about these images? And the answer is that they're either all of the land or they're all of the sky. The one image in the bottom left is all sky, but there is no image that has both sky and land in it at the same time. And that's where we get a lot of high contrast situations. And so these are low contrast, and they're very easy to capture with our digital sensors. Let's take a look at a couple of these images and look at the histograms. These are low contrast images. Most of the information is right in the middle of the histogram. It does not extend out to the left or to the right-hand side. Let's take one of these images, let's take it into Lightroom, and let's increase the contrast. We're kind of spreading that histogram out. And that image on the right, the darks are a little bit darker, the brights are a little bit brighter, and that causes it to have a little bit more saturation, and it looks a little bit better. So we can take a low contrast image and we can increase the contrast and kind of give that an even better look than what our raw image originally captured. And so this is one of the things that we look for is these low contrast scenes because we can make those look really good. It's very hard to make those high contrast scenes look really good in some situations. Here are two more images that are very low contrast. You can see that that histogram does not extend either to the left side or to the right side. If we take one of these images, we can increase the contrast, and there's a number of different ways that we can do this specifically in the different programs, but now the blacks become a little bit more black. The colors become a little bit more saturated. And so this is something that you can very easily do in pretty much any photo program on the computer. Taking a low contrast shot, adding a little bit of contrast, and it adds a little bit of pop, a little bit of zing to it, which can really help it out in many ways, as well as giving it just that extra little boost of color as well. And that's not even working on the saturation at all. That's just increasing the contrast of it. So that's a very helpful tool in what to look for and what to be careful of when you're framing up your shots. When it comes to the exposure, the main goal here is to capture the greatest range of light. Whatever that means as far as shutter speeds and apertures, we want to capture the greatest range of light possible. After that, we want to make sure that we're shooting raw files so that we can capture the widest range possible by the camera. And kind of first and foremost is to protect the highlights. It means we don't want to overexpose highlights because once they are gone, they are totally gone, and it generally looks very unnatural if there's a section of the sky that is absolutely pure white. Very unacceptable in a lot and most types of photographs. And then ETTR, exposing to the right, if you have that room, getting it a little bit on the brighter side so that you can darken it down later. Let's talk about exposure modes. You know these things, that dial on the top of your camera with the pictures on it and the letters. Where should we set that? Well, these little icons down at the bottom of the screen, that is set up for kind of general basic picture taking. Yeah, it kind of gets you set up in the right areas for certain shutter speeds and apertures in some situations. But it has a lot of child safety locks that don't allow you control. We want to get in and be able to control our camera manually. Now the program mode Well, the camera is figuring shutter speeds and apertures out, but we can get in there and have some sort of input about what's going on. So the camera is going to figure out shutter speeds and apertures. And in case you've ever wondered, what is the program? This master program. What is it? What's the dictate? What's the rule of the program? And the rule of the program is, don't let this person have too slow a shutter speed. It has no idea that you might be on a tripod. It's thinking, oh, this person's hand holding the camera. We better get them at a 60th of a second or faster. And if you're on a tripod, that would be totally the wrong decision in many situations. So one of the things you have to be careful of in the program mode is that with subtle different composition changes that you might make with the camera, and the background changes just a little bit, your camera could be changing shutter speeds and apertures. So you could go, well, I like the shutter speed and aperture, move the camera 1 degree, and suddenly the numbers are going to change on you. This is one of the reasons why I don't use program mode for landscape photography. All cameras have a system of being able to shift the numbers, either flexible program or program shift or some other name. And what this allows you to do is by turning one of the main control dials on your camera, it allows you to shift both shutter speeds and apertures at the same time. And this is kind of nice if you said, no, I don't really like that combination. Can we try a different number over here? Well, this works out pretty good. But the problem is that some cameras don't remember this. And so you might have it set into something that you really want, and you wait 30 seconds and you come back to your camera and it's going to reset back to the default setting. And this is just very, very irritating. On the other hand, some cameras stay locked into where they're set at, and you kind of forgot. I had it set up for one thing, and then I just went over here and randomly took a picture, and it was set up for this past situation. And so the program mode has limitations, and I never use it for this type of photography. Shutter priority, time value. This is where we get to choose the shutter speed, and the camera will figure out the aperture. I'm not a very big fan of this one either. On this one, we're going to be able to choose the shutter speed, and the camera will figure out the aperture. Once again, we have to be careful because the camera will be looking at the background, the foreground, everything, judging exposure, and the numbers are going to change on you according to the light levels. The problem with this mode is it's very easy to exceed the range of what your camera can handle and what your lens can handle. And so, yeah, you can set an 8,000th of a second, but that doesn't mean your camera has the right aperture to use with it. And so you have to be very careful when setting extremes on this. It doesn't work out very well. And so I am not a big fan of the shutter priority mode, except for in some very particular and unusual situations, because you can exceed the range of the camera. One area where it can work out, for instance, if you're doing bird photography and you need to maintain a fast shutter speed, but the birds are flying from the sunlight to the shadows and they're going all over the place, using auto ISO, which I'm not a big fan of, and we'll talk about ISO in just a moment, but you could use auto ISO and shutter priority combined together for some very random situations, like birds flying in and out of bright areas into dark trees. And so that's kind of my one exception on that particular mode setting. I like aperture priority for kind of general photography. I think it's very good for travel photography where you're not sure what your next shot is going to be. Set what you think is going to be an appropriate aperture. The camera is going to pick a shutter speed, and there are lots of shutter speeds that the camera gets to choose. And any aperture you choose, undoubtedly, in almost all but the most extreme situations, your camera is going to have a shutter speed that properly matches with that aperture priority. So I think this is a good general purpose mode for many types of things. And it's very easy to adjust those apertures because there's really not that many apertures on the camera. But be aware that your camera is constantly adjusting the shutter speed according to what it sees in the frame. That may or may not be your subject. If there's a subject in the background that's either darker or lighter, that's going to throw off your light meter. And so aperture priority is not a bad way to shoot in landscape photography, but my favorite is going full manual. The problem with aperture priority, shutter priority, and program is that the camera is ultimately deciding how bright or dark your photo is. And so in your viewfinder, you're of course going to see your light meter and the indicator, and it should hopefully be right under the 0 as far as a default position. But this is indicating how bright or dark your photographs are. And so in this first photograph in Yellowstone, it should be a very bright scene, but your camera thinks everything in the world is middle tone gray. And so in a scene like this, in an aperture priority mode, what you need to do is you need to go to your exposure compensation dial or button, wherever that is on your camera, and you're going to need to brighten this up because snow is brighter than 18% gray. And so you're going to have to dial this in anytime you have a subject that is brighter than normal. And if you go into the forest, a forest, in case you didn't know it, is darker than average 18% gray. And so you're going to have to go into pictures like this, and you're going to have to dial down the exposure compensation perhaps to a -1 level. And so if you are using aperture priority, get very comfortable using exposure compensation because you're going to need it on a regular basis, whether you're photographing something bright or something dark. And I don't like making these changes because unless the light on my subject is changing, this just gets to be a lot of fiddlesome camera work that I don't want to be doing. I do enjoy it for travel photography, and I know that there are some people that use this on a regular basis and that works fully well for them, and that's great. But one of the things to note, because one of the tips I gave you earlier is about using the self-timer mode. And using the auto exposure mode and the self-timer mode is a recipe for a problem. Here's the problem, is that in your camera, the way your camera meters is that your main mirror is a partially silvered mirror and light bounces down to a light meter in the bottom. If you use a self-timer and you are no longer blocking the light coming in the eyepiece, light will stream in from the back of the camera. It will go through the mirror, which is partially silvered, and that light will end up on the light meter in the bottom of the camera, and it's going to throw off your images because it thinks there's more light coming in than there actually is, and your pictures are going to result in being too dark. What can you do about this? Well, some cameras give you eyepiece covers for use when you are using the self-timer. You'll take that eyepiece cover and you'll put it over the eyepiece to block the light coming in while you're doing a self-timer shot. So if you were doing a self-timer shot, you could clip that little piece on. Now, some of the nice cameras have an actual lever on the back of the camera right beside the eyepiece, and when you flip that lever, it drops a blind that covers the eyepiece. And this is kind of the hallmark of a very high-end camera if it's got this little convenient switch in there. And so this is blocking that extra light, which could throw off your light meter in any of the auto exposure modes. It won't affect the manual mode. It could potentially affect the metering system. So if you were going to set the camera up in a remote location, for instance, and a lot of cameras have a Wi-Fi remote now that you could activate. And if you're going to put a camera over here and you're not going to be behind it, you should close that eyepiece blind, you should put the cover over it, or at the very least put a piece of gaffer tape over the back so that you don't have light streaming in the back of your camera if you are using any the auto exposure modes. Now, let's get to the serious stuff. Manual, full manual. This is where I shoot pretty much all my nature and landscape work. And it's a pretty simple concept. We have our shutter speeds, we have our apertures, and I'm going to pick one that I think is most important, and I'm going to set it. In many cases, I'm setting the aperture first. Where? Well, that depends on the subject. We'll get to that in a moment. And then what I do is I need to set my shutter speed, and I set that by looking at the light meter and just start turning the shutter speed until the light meter hits the center area or wherever I think it needs to be for that particular type of situation. And then I will commence shooting pictures, lots of pictures in the same area, so long as the scene is not changing in brightness. So let me share with you an experience that I had at Yellowstone this last winter. I went to go photograph Old Faithful, and I wanted to get lots of different shots in a short 2-minute period of time. And I knew it was going to be kind of a light scene, and so when I set up my manual exposure, I exposed a little bit to the right-hand side. Plus exposure, about 1/3, 2/3 of a stop. Now, as the camera, if you could look over my shoulder while I was taking these pictures, the camera was reading much more brightness because there was a different amount of brightness in each of the photographs. But all of these photographs are at the exact same aperture, at the exact same shutter speed. And I was in manual, it's just the light meter was saying, hey, it's getting brighter here. And if I had time to talk to the camera, I would have said, yes, it is getting brighter because there's more bright stuff in the frame. That's normal for what's going on here. If I had had the camera in an aperture, a shutter priority, or a program mode where the camera is figuring out the light, here is what would have happened in that situation. As you can see in this example, it gets darker as we go from left to right because it is actually more brightness in the image, and the camera is trying to compensate for the brightness by making it darker. And this is kind of the problem with any of the auto exposure modes in the camera, is that your camera doesn't understand subject content and how bright and reflective it is of the light. And so the camera thinks it's getting the right exposure, but it's not the right exposure at all. In cases where you have a lighting that is not changing, so if you have consistent lighting and the lighting during this 2 minutes was not changing very much, I could set the exact same shutter speed and the same aperture and get nice, even exposures with the best looking histogram possible in each of these cases. And so this is why I shoot manual exposure most all the time. It takes me a few extra seconds to get the first shot, but every shot afterwards comes out much more consistently, much more evenly, and much to a preferred place. Now, one way of ensuring that you got the right exposure is exposure bracketing, and many cameras have this feature. And what it allows you to do is it shoots anywhere from 2, usually 3, sometimes 5, 7, or 9 shots at different exposure levels. And this is something that people who shoot HDR photography, and they shoot multiple different levels so that they can take this, compress it all into one image, and take the best information from each image. Landscape photographers in the past did it because they couldn't see their results on film, and they wanted to make sure that they got exactly the right exposure. It seems to be much less necessary these days when you can look at the histogram, but I will occasionally bracket just so that I can work with different types of images later on. If you have the feature in your camera, you should definitely be familiar with how to turn it on and off and how to use it, because it can be helpful for making quick decisions out in the field, because the camera will fire through and make these setting adjustments for you much, much faster than you can make them yourself. And perhaps you might want to play with HDR or some sort of exposure blending in the future. And so you're going to use this with scenes that have a very high dynamic range or very tricky in lighting. These tend to work best in aperture priority because you don't want the depth of field change between the photographs. What the camera is changing when you're in aperture priority is it's changing the shutter speed. And generally, if you're on a tripod, which you should be for being in bracketing because all the pictures need to be framed up exactly the same to have them the most benefit, is that you want to have the same shutter speed, or excuse me, you want to have the same depth of field, and the shutter speed doesn't matter because the subjects are not really moving around. Another concept for exposure is the Sunny 16 rule. And the Sunny 16 rule was a little bit more applicable back in the days of film, back in the days when we had mechanical cameras, or for anybody who happens to have a camera that doesn't have a battery in it. You could set the exposure simply by knowing the Sunny 16 rule, which states, if in full sun, the exposure is f16 and a shutter speed that is the same as your ISO. So let's give this a try out on a photograph. Okay, so here's a photograph. It's taken in full sun, right? Well, let's set the exposure using the Sunny 16 rule. First off, let's just assume that our ISO is at 100. That's generally the best setting on most of our cameras. Now, what do we set next? Well, it's called the Sunny 16 rule, so let's set f16 on the aperture. Now, where do we set the shutter speed? Well, what is our ISO at? 100? What's the closest shutter speed do we have to 100? And that would be 125. And so that is going to get us perfect exposure in that situation. Very easy to remember the Sunny 16, and you can always kind of double check your own light meter if you are working out in bright sunshine. And so the Sunny 16 rule, f16 and a shutter speed that is equal to your ISO.